The key slipped into the lock with a familiar click, and I pushed the front door open, expecting the usual hum of the evening. Maybe Kate would be in the kitchen, whipping up one of her experimental dinners. Maybe she'd be curled up on the couch, lost in one of those crime novels she loved. What I didn't expect, what I could never have prepared for, was the scene that unfolded before me. The living room was dim, the only light coming from the flicker of candles scattered across the room. At first, I thought it was some romantic setup for the two of us. But then I saw them. Kate, my Kate, wrapped in the arms of another man. Their faces were close, too close, and her lips met his with a passion that had long faded between us. I stood there, paralyzed, watching them. Jason. It had to be Jason. The famous sculptor she always talked about, was the one she admired so much. Now I understood why. It wasn't just his art she admired. I couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, suffocating. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to do something. Yell, cry, smash something. But I just stood there, a ghost in my own home. Kate's eyes fluttered open, and when she saw me, her expression shifted from bliss to horror in an instant. Jason turned too, his face a mask of confusion, then realization. He stepped back, but it was too late. The damage was done. Sam. Kate's voice was barely a whisper, her face pale as she took a step toward me. But I couldn't bear to hear whatever excuses she had. I turned and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind me, just as she had left my heart. The world outside was dark, but nothing compared to the darkness that was now inside me. I didn't sleep that night. The image of Kate and Jason replayed in my mind on an endless loop, like some sick movie I couldn't turn off. By morning, the numbness had set in, dulling the edges of my pain but leaving a hollow void in its place. I couldn't face Kate, couldn't even think about confronting her. What was there to say? Words wouldn't change what had happened, and wouldn't erase the betrayal. So, I threw myself into something, anything, to keep my mind occupied. The house was old, always in need of repairs, and I'd been putting off fixing the basement for years. Now it seemed like the perfect escape. The sledgehammer felt heavy in my hands, but the weight was comforting. Each swing was a release, a way to channel the rage that boiled beneath the surface. The walls came down easily. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed to destroy something, to feel the physical impact of my anger. Days blurred into weeks. I worked late into the night, smashing down walls, ripping up floors, building new ones. The house was transforming, but inside, I was still the same, broken, angry, lost. It was during one of those late-night trips to the hardware store that I met James. He was standing in the same aisle, staring blankly at a shelf full of power tools, looking as lost as I felt. I don't know why I approached him. Maybe I saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood the pain that was eating me alive. "You working on something big?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He looked at me, his eyes tired and hollow. "Yeah, or maybe just trying to destroy something." I nodded. I knew that feeling all too well. We talked, and it didn't take long before the truth spilled out. He'd been betrayed too. His wife had cheated on him, just like Kate had on me. The anger, the hurt, it was all there, mirrored in his eyes. We kept talking, sharing our stories over cheap beer and the hum of fluorescent lights. The pain was still there, but for the first time since that night, I didn't feel so alone. And that's when the idea started to form. As James talked about his own need for revenge, a plan began to take shape in my mind. Jason wasn't just going to get away with this. No, he needed to be exposed and humiliated, just like he had humiliated me. And with James's help, I knew exactly how to do it. James and I started meeting more often, our conversations growing darker with each passing day. At first, it was just about the pain, how it gnawed at us, leaving us hollow and angry. But soon, the talk shifted to Jason. He wasn't just a man who had ruined my marriage, he was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in our lives. And we wanted him to pay. The idea of revenge was intoxicating. It gave me a purpose, something to focus on besides the wreckage of my marriage. James was all in, too. His bitterness ran deep, and he was just as eager to see Jason fall. We began to plan, carefully laying out every detail. The first step was research. We needed to know everything about Jason, his routines, his connections, his vulnerabilities. James was surprisingly resourceful, finding out about an upcoming gallery event where Jason would be the star. It was a prestigious exhibition, one that could make or break careers in the art world. The perfect stage for our revenge. We spent hours going over the blueprints of the gallery, analyzing security, and figuring out how we could pull off what we had in mind without getting caught. I found myself spending more time on this plan than on anything else, neglecting the house renovations that had once been my distraction. But I didn't care. This was more important. This was about justice, my twisted version of it, at least. As the plan took shape, I started to feel a strange sense of excitement. The numbness that had consumed me since discovering Kate's betrayal began to fade, replaced by a grim determination. I was no longer just a victim. I was taking control, turning my pain into action. James was the same. He was meticulous, almost obsessive, about every detail. We weren't just going to embarrass Jason, we were going to destroy him. We wanted to expose him for the fraud he was, to make sure everyone saw the real man behind the polished artist's persona. And if Kate was caught in the fallout, so be it. She had made her choice. The night of the gallery event was approaching fast. And with each passing day, I felt the tension building. I knew there was no turning back. I didn't want to turn back. This was the only way I could make sense of what had happened, the only way I could move on. The day before the event, James and I met one last time to go over the plan. We sat in a dingy bar on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would recognize us or remember our faces. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer and cigarettes, and the dim lighting cast shadows over James's face, making him look even more intense than usual. "We've covered everything," James said, spreading out the blueprints on the table between us. His finger traced the layout of the gallery, stopping at the spots we'd marked earlier. "The speakers will be hidden here and here. They're synced to my phone, so I'll trigger them when Jason starts his speech." "And the projector?" I asked, leaning in closer. "Set up and ready. It's small enough to go unnoticed until it's too late. The footage will start playing as soon as the audio kicks in." James looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a mix of excitement and something darker. "You've got the paint bomb?" I nodded, reaching into my bag and pulling out the device I'd been working on for weeks. It was crude but effective, a small canister rigged with a timer, designed to explode and cover Jason's latest sculpture in bright red paint. It was the final touch, a symbolic destruction of everything he stood for. "Good," James said, his voice low and steady. "We'll be in and out before anyone knows what's happening. And when it's over, Jason will never recover." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we were about to do sinking in. This wasn't just some prank. We were about to ruin a man's career, to drag his name through the mud in front of all his peers. And I couldn't deny the satisfaction that thought brought me. But there was also a gnawing feeling in the back of my mind, a small voice that questioned whether this was really the right thing to do. What if it didn't bring the closure I was hoping for? What if it just made everything worse? I pushed those thoughts aside. It was too late for doubts. This was happening, and I was all in. There was no other way to deal with the betrayal, no other way to make Jason understand the pain he had caused. James and I finished our drinks and left the bar, parting ways with a final nod. The next time we'd see each other would be at the gallery when everything would come to a head. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what was to come, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I kept picturing Kate's face when she realized what I had done, Jason's expression when his world came crashing down around him. It was all I could think about. By morning, I was exhausted but wired, ready to put our plan into action. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when everything would change. The gallery was a masterpiece in itself, a sleek, modern space with high ceilings and walls lined with pristine white. The place was buzzing with the kind of people who loved to be seen at events like this. Art critics, collectors, and socialites, all dressed to impress. But none of them mattered to me. The only people I cared about were Jason and Kate. James and I arrived separately, blending in with the crowd, our suits as sharp as any of the guests. I scanned the room, searching for Kate. It didn't take long to spot her. She was standing near one of Jason's sculptures, a drink in her hand, laughing at something one of her friends had said. She looked radiant, like she didn't have a care in the world. Seeing her like that made my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about Jason. Jason was across the room, surrounded by admirers. He looked every bit the successful artist, confident, charming, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. As I watched him, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. He had no idea what was coming. James and I exchanged a brief nod from across the room. Everything was in place. The speakers were hidden in the corners. The projector was set up, and the paint bomb was ready to go. All we had to do now was wait for the right moment. The event went on, the guests mingling and admiring Jason's work. I could feel the tension building inside me, each minute bringing us closer to the moment of truth. Jason was due to give a speech soon, and that was when we would strike. Finally, the time came. The gallery lights dimmed slightly, and the murmurs of the crowd quieted as Jason stepped up to a small stage at the front of the room. He looked out at the sea of faces, a self-satisfied smile on his lips. This was his moment, his night. "Thank you all for being here," Jason began, his voice smooth and confident. "It's an honor to share my work with you. Art is more than just a visual experience, it's an emotional journey, a reflection of the soul." As he spoke, I glanced over at James. He was ready, his hand hovering over his phone, which would trigger the chaos we had meticulously planned. Jason was in the middle of waxing poetic about his artistic vision when James gave me the signal. I nodded back, and he pressed the button. The speakers crackled to life, filling the gallery with an eerie, distorted sound that sent a ripple of confusion through the crowd. Jason faltered on the stage, his eyes darting around the room, trying to figure out what was happening. And then it hit. The audio we had prepared, a recording of Jason and Kate in the throes of their affair, blared through the speakers, loud and unmistakable. The gasps from the crowd were immediate, followed by whispers and shocked glances. Jason's face turned ashen as he realized what was being broadcast to the entire gallery. But we weren't done yet. The projector clicked on, casting grainy footage of Jason and Kate onto the wall behind him. It wasn't explicit, but it was clear enough. The looks on their faces, the way they touched each other, it told the whole story. The room descended into chaos. Jason tried to shout over the noise, to explain, but his words were lost in the uproar. People were backing away from him. Their admiration turned to disgust. Kate, who had been standing near the back of the room, was frozen in place, her face a mask of horror as she watched the footage play out. And then, the final blow. The timer on the paint bomb hit 0, and with a soft pop, the canister exploded, splattering Jason's prized sculpture in a vivid red. It was as if the piece itself had been drenched in blood, a brutal, visceral representation of everything he had done to me. The crowd recoiled, some even shrieking as the red paint dripped down the sculpture. Jason stared at the ruined piece, his career, his reputation, everything he had worked for, literally painted in the color of his betrayal. For a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. The satisfaction I had expected didn't come. Instead, there was a hollow emptiness, a sense that something vital had been lost in the process. I had wanted revenge, but now that it was done, I wasn't sure it had been worth it. I turned to leave, pushing through the panicked crowd. James was already gone, slipping away in the confusion. I caught a glimpse of Kate as I headed for the exit. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or sorrow, but it didn't matter. I was done with her, with all of it. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the gallery. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head, but the emptiness remained. The act of revenge had consumed me, and now that it was over, I was left with nothing. I walked away from the gallery, leaving the chaos behind. I didn't look back. There was no point. I had done what I came to do, and now it was time to figure out what came next. The night felt endless as I walked aimlessly through the city streets, the sounds of distant traffic and the occasional siren filling the silence in my mind. I couldn't go home, not yet. The house, with its half-finished renovations and the ghosts of what had been, was the last place I wanted to be. Instead, I found myself wandering. The adrenaline that had carried me through the evening slowly wearing off, leaving a deep exhaustion in its place. I kept replaying the scene at the gallery, but it all felt surreal, like it had happened to someone else. The chaos, the destruction, the way Jason's face crumpled when he realized everything was over. It should have given me some sense of closure, some finality. But all it had done was expose the depth of the void inside me. Eventually, I ended up in a small park, the kind that was usually full of families during the day but was eerily deserted at night. I sat down on a bench, my body heavy with fatigue, and stared up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible through the city's haze, but they were there, distant and indifferent to everything that had happened. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but there was no one to call. I hadn't told anyone about what was happening. My friends had slowly drifted away during the years of my marriage, and now I realized how alone I truly was. Even James, who had been my partner in this twisted venture, was just a stranger I'd met in a hardware store. We'd shared our pain and our anger, but that was all. There was no real bond there, nothing that could last beyond the mutual destruction we'd sought. The night dragged on, and by the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I felt like a shell of the person I'd been before all of this started. The emptiness was still there, gnawing at me, but now it was joined by a deep, gnawing sense of regret. I had wanted revenge, but I hadn't anticipated the cost. I hadn't realized how hollow it would feel to bring someone else down, to tear their life apart in the same way mine had been. I finally made my way home as the sun rose, the light of day making everything feel more real, more permanent. The house was exactly as I'd left it, quiet, empty, and incomplete. I dropped my keys on the counter and collapsed onto the couch, too tired to do anything else. The weight of what I'd done pressed down on me, and for the first time since discovering Kate's betrayal, I felt the urge to cry. But the tears didn't come. Instead, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night still playing out in my mind. What had I really accomplished? Jason's career might be over, his reputation ruined, but it hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't made me whole again. Kate was still gone, and our marriage was still shattered. I was still the same broken man I'd been before, only now with more scars. The days after the gallery event were a blur of emptiness and isolation. I avoided the news, avoided people, and most of all, I avoided thinking about what came next. I couldn't face the aftermath of what I'd done, so I buried myself in the remnants of my renovation projects, working until my body ached and my mind was numb. But the world didn't let me hide for long. The phone calls started first, anonymous numbers, reporters, and a few old acquaintances who had somehow heard about the disaster at the gallery. I didn't answer any of them. I didn't need to hear the questions to know what they were. The whispers of scandal would spread quickly through the small circles that Kate and I had once moved in, and eventually, they would find their way to me. Kate tried to reach out, too. At first, it was just a few texts, short, vague messages asking if we could talk. I ignored them. Then came the calls, but I let those go to voicemail. I couldn't face her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I spent my nights in the basement, surrounded by tools and half-finished projects, trying to work through the thoughts that wouldn't stop churning in my mind. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel from Jason's downfall had never materialized, and the emptiness left in its wake was suffocating. The anger that had driven me had burned out, leaving behind only ashes. One evening, as I was about to put on another coat of paint in the basement, I heard a knock at the door. I froze, the paintbrush in my hand dripping onto the floor. No one had knocked on that door in weeks. The knock came again, more insistent this time. I set the brush down and walked upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Kate standing there. She looked different, tired, worn out, as if the events of the past few weeks had taken as much of a toll on her as they had on me. We stared at each other for a long moment, neither of us knowing what to say. "Sam," she finally said, her voice soft and unsure. "Can we talk?" I wanted to slam the door in her face, to tell her to leave and never come back. But instead, I just stepped aside and let her in. She walked past me, her eyes taking in the state of the house, the unfinished renovations, the signs of my descent into obsession and madness. She sat down on the couch, the same couch where I'd spent so many sleepless nights, and looked up at me. "I heard what happened at the gallery," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't believe you. Why, Sam? Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with all the things that had been left unsaid for too long. I didn't have an answer for her. Not one that would make sense. I had done it because I didn't know how else to deal with the pain. I wanted her to hurt as much as I did because I thought it would make me feel better. But it hadn't. All it had done was deepen the wound. "I don't know," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what else to do." Kate's eyes filled with tears, and she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "I never wanted any of this," she said, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. Sam, I made a mistake. A terrible mistake." Her words cut through me like a knife. reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. But there was something in her voice, in her eyes, that made me pause. Regret, guilt, maybe even a hint of the love we had once shared, buried deep beneath the rubble of everything that had happened. We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything we had done to each other pressing down on us. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. The damage was done, and we both knew it. But as I looked at Kate, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for us to find some kind of peace. If not together, then at least within ourselves. I don't know where we go from here, I finally said, my voice thick with emotion. But I think we need to figure it out. For both our sakes. Kate nodded, wiping away a tear. Yeah, I think we do. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, it was time to start letting go of the past. To stop letting it define me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. And maybe, just maybe, we could both find a way to heal. The days following Kate's visit were tense. We agreed to talk, but neither of us knew where to start. The wounds were too fresh, too raw, and the weight of everything that had happened hung between us like a thick fog. I kept myself busy during the day, returning to the renovation work that had once been my distraction, but now it felt different, less of an escape and more like a way to rebuild. Not just the house, but my life. Finally, after a week of circling each other like strangers in our own home, we sat down at the kitchen table, the silence between us heavy with anticipation. The kitchen was one of the few rooms in the house that was still intact, untouched by my frantic attempts to repair everything around me. It seemed fitting, in a way, that we would have this conversation here, in a place that had remained unchanged. Kate was the first to speak, her voice quiet and unsure. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Sam. About us. About everything. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything yet. My emotions were still a mess, a tangled web of anger, hurt, and confusion, and I didn't want to make things worse by saying the wrong thing. I know I can't take back what I did, Kate continued, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. I hurt you in a way that I never imagined. I can't even begin to express how sorry I am. Hearing her apologize like that, genuinely, without excuses or justifications, hit me harder than I expected. I had been so wrapped up in my own pain that I hadn't allowed myself to consider what she might be going through. But now, seeing her like this, I realized that she was hurting too. Maybe not in the same way, but the pain was there, nonetheless. I didn't know how to handle it, I finally said, my voice low and rough. When I found out, it felt like my whole world was falling apart. And all I could think about was making you feel the same way. Making Jason pay for what he did to us. Kate looked up at me then, her eyes filled with tears. And did it help? Did any of it help? I shook my head, the truth of her words sinking in. No, it didn't. It just made everything worse. I thought revenge would give me some kind of closure, but all it did was make me feel emptier. We sat there in silence for a while, the reality of what we had done to each other settling over us like a heavy blanket. There were no easy answers, no simple solutions. We had both made mistakes that had shattered our marriage and left us both broken. But as I looked at Kate, I realized that despite everything, a part of me still cared about her. Maybe it was the years we had spent together, the memories we had shared, or maybe it was something deeper, something that hadn't been completely destroyed by the betrayal. Whatever it was, I knew that if we were going to move forward, we had to start by being honest with each other. I don't know if we can fix this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I think we owe it to ourselves to try. Kate nodded, her tears spilling over as she reached across the table and took my hand. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting us in the midst of all the chaos. I want to try, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know where we go from here, but I want to try. And with those words, we began the slow, painful process of picking up the pieces of our shattered lives. Unsure of where it would lead, but determined to face it together. The first steps toward rebuilding our marriage were tentative and awkward. We both knew that trust couldn't be restored overnight, and that it would take time and effort from both of us. The hurt was still there, just beneath the surface, ready to flare up at any moment, but we were trying to find a way forward. We started with small things, like spending time together without the weight of the past hanging over us. We would take walks around the neighborhood, talking about mundane things, work, the weather, the people we passed by. It was strange at first, trying to act normal when everything between us had changed, but slowly, it began to feel more natural. Kate suggested that we see a therapist, and although the idea initially made me uncomfortable, I agreed. We both knew that we couldn't do this alone. We needed help to navigate the complex emotions we were dealing with, to understand why things had gone so wrong, and how we could avoid making the same mistakes in the future. Therapy was challenging, to say the least. We had to confront things we had buried deep inside, resentments, fears, and insecurities that had festered over the years. There were moments when I wanted to walk out, to just leave and never come back, but I didn't. And neither did Kate. We stuck with it, even when it was painful because we knew it was the only way to heal. One of the hardest parts was facing the reality of why the affair had happened in the first place. It wasn't just about Kate's betrayal or Jason's manipulation. It was about the cracks that had formed in our marriage long before that, the distance that had grown between us without either of us really noticing. We had both been guilty of neglecting our relationship, of taking each other for granted. And that realization was almost as painful as the affair itself. But as difficult as those sessions were, they were also cathartic. We were finally talking about the things that had been left unsaid for too long. And in doing so, we began to understand each other in a way we hadn't before. It was a slow process, but bit by bit, the anger and resentment started to fade, replaced by a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way back to each other. There were setbacks, of course, moments when the old wounds would reopen and the hurt would come rushing back. But we didn't give up. We kept pushing forward, holding on to the belief that there was something worth saving. I also had to come to terms with my own actions, the revenge I had sought, the chaos I had caused. It wasn't easy to admit that I had gone too far, that I had allowed my pain to drive me to a place I never wanted to go. But owning up to it was the only way I could move on, the only way I could truly begin to heal. Kate, too, had her own guilt to deal with, and watching her struggle with it was both painful and necessary. She had to face the consequences of her actions, just as I had to face mine. But through it all, we supported each other, even when it was hard. Even when it would have been easier to walk away. As the weeks turned into months, something began to shift between us. The conversations became less strained, the silences less uncomfortable. We started to laugh again, to share moments that reminded us of why we had fallen in love in the first place. The trust that had been shattered was slowly, painstakingly being rebuilt, one fragile piece at a time. The house, too, began to take shape. The renovations I had started in a frenzy of despair were now being completed with a different kind of energy. A determination to create a space that reflected the new chapter we were trying to write together. It wasn't about escaping the past anymore, it was about building a future. And as the house came together, so did we. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. The scars of what had happened would always be there, a reminder of how close we had come to losing everything. But those scars were also a testament to our resilience, to the fact that we had chosen to stay and fight for each other when it would have been easier to walk away. In the end, it wasn't the revenge or the destruction that defined us. It was the decision to rebuild, to forgive, and to find a way forward together. As I looked at Kate one evening, standing in the finished kitchen with a smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized that maybe, just maybe, we had a chance to make it work after all. The night after Kate's final attempt to reach out to Jason, something inside me snapped. The tension between us had been building for weeks, ever since she told me she wanted closure. I had tried to be understanding, to accept that she needed to tie up loose ends to move on. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about closure. There was still something unresolved between them, something that had never truly ended. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Kate was in the next room, pretending to sleep, but I could feel the distance between us like a cold void. I couldn't stand it any longer. The thought of her talking to Jason, of her seeking something from him that she couldn't find with me, twisted in my gut like a knife. I got up, moving quietly so as not to wake her, though I knew she was already awake. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through the messages she had exchanged with him, the ones she didn't know I'd seen. My hands trembled as I read the words, each one a reminder of the betrayal that had nearly destroyed us. It was past midnight when I made the decision. I needed to see him. I needed to confront Jason face to face, to put an end to this once and for all. I dressed quickly, my movements fueled by a mix of anger and desperation. Kate must have heard me because she appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "Sam, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaky. I didn't answer right away, just continued lacing up my shoes. "I'm going to see him," I finally said, not looking at her. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with alarm. "Sam, please don't. This isn't the way. This is the only way," I interrupted, standing up and grabbing my keys. "I need to end this. We need to end this." "End what? There's nothing left, Sam. Jason doesn't matter. He never did, not really. It was just a mistake, a terrible mistake." "Then why do you keep talking to him?" I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "Why can't you let him go?" Kate flinched as if I had struck her, and for a moment, I almost regretted my words. Almost. But the anger, the hurt, was too overwhelming. I needed to do this, for my own sanity, for us. I brushed past her and headed for the door. "Sam, please," she called after me, her voice breaking. "Don't do this. Don't let him destroy us any more than he already has." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. For a moment, I considered turning back, reconsidering. But then the image of Jason's smug face, his hands on Kate, flashed through my mind, and the rage surged again. "I'm doing this for us," I said without turning around. "I'll be back." The drive to Jason's place felt surreal, the city streets passing by in a blur. My thoughts were a chaotic mix of memories, anger, and the overwhelming need to confront the man who had shattered my life. I didn't know what I was going to say, or even what I hoped to achieve, but I knew I had to face him. I had to look him in the eye and see for myself if there was any remorse, any acknowledgement of the damage he'd caused. When I pulled up to his building, the familiar anger flared again. It was late, and the streets were mostly deserted, but I didn't care. I marched up to his door and pounded on it, the sound echoing through the empty hallway. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and I wondered if he was even home. But then I heard movement inside, and the door opened. Jason stood there, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. He was dressed casually like he had been relaxing, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. "Sam?" he asked, his voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" I didn't give him a chance to say anything more. I shoved him back, forcing my way into his apartment. He stumbled but quickly regained his balance, his eyes narrowing as he realized I wasn't here for a friendly chat. "Sam, what the hell?" "Shut up," I growled, slamming the door behind me. "You're going to listen to me for once, Jason." He raised his hands defensively, but there was a flash of arrogance in his eyes that only fueled my anger. "Listen, man, I don't know what you're thinking, but..." "I'm thinking," I interrupted, stepping closer to him, "that you need to understand the damage you've done. The lives you've ruined." Jason frowned, finally showing some concern, but it wasn't enough. "Look, Sam, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But you did," I snapped, my voice rising. "You took everything from me. My wife, my life, everything. And now you think you can just walk away? Like none of it matters?" His expression hardened, the fake concern dropping away. "Kate made her own choices, Sam. You can't blame me for everything." His words hit like a punch to the gut. But I didn't back down. "You manipulated her, Jason. You took advantage of her when she was vulnerable. And for what? For some twisted sense of satisfaction?" Jason didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said enough. He didn't care. Not really. And that realization was like a final blow, shattering any remaining hope that this confrontation might give me some closure. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, trying to find some way to end this without doing something I'd regret. But the rage was still there, boiling under the surface, and I didn't trust myself to keep it in check. "Stay away from her," I finally said, my voice low and dangerous. "You've done enough damage. If you ever come near Kate again, I swear to God, I won't just walk away." Jason stared at me, his expression unreadable, but he didn't say anything. Maybe he saw something in my eyes that made him realize I wasn't bluffing, or maybe he just didn't care enough to argue. Either way, I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out, leaving him standing in the middle of his perfect, empty apartment. As I drove home, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving me drained and shaky. I had done what I came to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. If anything, it felt like a defeat, like I had let Jason drag me down to his level, to a place where nothing mattered but the anger and the pain. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm the storm inside me. The house was dark, and Kate was probably still awake, waiting to see if I would return. I wasn't sure what I was going to say to her, or how I could explain what I had just done. But as I walked up the steps and opened the door, I knew that whatever came next, it was time to stop letting Jason control my life. It was time to reclaim what was left of it, to start rebuilding in a way that didn't involve tearing others down. The morning after I confronted Jason, the house was quiet. Kate and I had barely spoken when I got home, both of us too exhausted and emotionally drained to continue the conversation we'd started the night before. I hadn't slept much, my mind replaying the events over and over, trying to make sense of what I had done and where it had left us. When I finally got out of bed, the sun was already high in the sky, streaming through the windows and casting a warm, golden light across the floor. It felt strange, almost surreal, like the world had moved on while I was stuck in the past. I found Kate in the kitchen, sipping a cup of coffee and staring out the window. She looked up when I walked in, her expression guarded, as if she wasn't sure what to expect. The tension between us was palpable, but there was also something else, something softer, more tentative. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "Morning," she replied, her voice equally quiet. She gestured to the coffee pot. "There's more if you want some." "Thanks." I poured myself a cup, the simple routine of it grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. We stood there in silence for a moment, the awkwardness between us almost unbearable. But I knew we couldn't keep avoiding the conversation we needed to have. "I went to see Jason last night," I finally said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I needed to confront him, to make sure he understood what he did to us. Kate nodded slowly, not looking at me. "And did it help?" I took a sip of coffee, thinking about how to answer. "No, not really. I thought it would, but it didn't change anything. It just made me realize how much I've let him control my life, even after everything that's happened." She looked up then, her eyes searching mine. "And what now, Sam? What do we do now?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with uncertainty. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't keep living like this, trapped in the past, letting the pain and anger dictate our every move. "We start over," I said, setting my coffee cup down and meeting her gaze. "We let go of what happened and focus on what's ahead. It won't be easy, but I think we can find a way back to each other. If we're both willing to try." Kate's eyes filled with tears, but there was a glimmer of hope in them too. "I want that, Sam. I want us to be okay again. I know it won't be the same, but maybe we can build something new. Something stronger." I nodded, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders for the first time in months. "Yeah, I think we can." We stood there for a long moment. The silence between us no longer uncomfortable, but full of possibility. There was still a long road ahead, full of challenges and setbacks, but for the first time, I felt like we were facing it together. The past would always be a part of us, a scar that would never fully heal, but it didn't have to define us. As I reached across the table and took her hand, I knew that we were making a choice to move forward, to rebuild, to find a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that whatever came next, we would face it together. The journey wasn't over, but it was a start. A new chapter in our story, one that we would write together, one day at a time. The months that followed were a test of our resolve, filled with small victories and painful setbacks. But through it all, Kate and I held on to the commitment we had made to each other, to rebuild our lives together, one step at a time. We moved out of the old house, deciding that a fresh start required a new place. One that wasn't haunted by the ghosts of what we had been through. We found a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, not too far from the city but far enough that it felt like a different world. It was smaller than our old house, but it was cozy and filled with light, and that was enough for us. The process of settling in was both daunting and therapeutic. We spent our weekends unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and slowly turning the house into a home. There were moments when the weight of the past would press down on us, but we faced it together, talking openly about our fears and insecurities in a way we hadn't before. Therapy remained a constant in our lives. We continued to attend sessions, both individually and as a couple, and it became a safe space where we could express the things we struggled to say to each other in the quiet of our home. We talked about the affair, about the ways it had changed us, and about how we could learn to trust again. It wasn't easy, and there were days when it felt like we were making no progress at all, but slowly, the walls we had built around ourselves began to come down. Kate started to pursue her passion for photography again, something she had abandoned during the turmoil of the past year. Watching her rediscover that part of herself was bittersweet. It was a reminder of the person she had been before everything fell apart. But it was also a sign that she was healing, finding her way back to the things that made her happy. As for me, I found solace in the simplicity of our new life. The anger that had once consumed me had faded, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. I threw myself into my work, but this time it wasn't about escaping my emotions. It was about building something meaningful, both in my career and in my personal life. One of the most significant changes was our relationship with Jason. After the confrontation, he seemed to disappear from our lives. There were no more late-night texts, no more attempts at contact. It was as if he had finally accepted that his role in our story was over. And while the pain of what he had done still lingered, it no longer defined us. We began to reconnect with old friends, people we had drifted away from during the chaos. Some of them had known about the affair, others had only heard rumors, but all of them welcomed us back with open arms. It was a relief to find that we could still laugh, still enjoy the company of others without the shadow of the past hanging over us. There were still difficult days, of course. Trust was something that had to be rebuilt brick by brick, and there were moments when the doubts and fears would creep back in. But each time, we made the choice to talk it out, to face the discomfort instead of letting it fester. We were learning to be vulnerable with each other in ways we hadn't been before. And that vulnerability was slowly becoming the foundation of something stronger. As the seasons changed, so did we. The winter was harsh, but it gave way to a spring that felt like a rebirth, both for us and for the life we were building together. We spent more time outside, exploring the neighborhood, planting a garden, and finding joy in the small things that had once seemed insignificant. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Kate turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever fully move on from this, Sam? Or will it always be a part of us?" I considered her question carefully before answering. "I think it will always be a part of us," I said, taking her hand in mine. "But that doesn't mean it has to define us. We can learn from it, grow from it, and use it to build something better. It's not about forgetting, it's about finding a way to live with it, and to keep moving forward." She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I like that. Moving forward." As we sat there, hand in hand, I realized that we had come full circle. The journey we had been on was painful, filled with moments of despair and doubt, but it also brought us closer in ways I never could have imagined. We were not the same people we had been when this all started, but maybe that was a good thing. We had been broken, but we had also been remade, stronger and more resilient than before. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The future was still uncertain, still filled with challenges and unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid. We were moving forward, together, and that was all that mattered.